That's Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites. I'll get my tongue around that. From Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters." No, my daughters. It's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. At this they wept aloud. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if death separates you and me." Then Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her. She stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning.
Dear Lord and Father, draw us into your word as we look at remarkable women like Naomi and Ruth, and help us to learn from them. Teach us to know how to live in the light of despairing situations, yet live without hopeless despair. Dress us for godly living. Amen. Well, please excuse this hard expression, but sometimes life sucks. There are curveballs that knock us off our rocker. That which we thought we had under control gets out of control, and we find ourselves reeling in a world of pain. And every now and then we meet someone or we hear about someone who has it much tougher than we have. I personally don't feel that qualified to talk about despair or suffering, because although there have been times in my life where I've felt despair or I've suffered, I'm very aware that there are many others around me, even in this room, far more qualified to talk about this topic than me. Among us, there are widows, cancer sufferers or survivors, there are refugees, those who have suffered physical, sexual or emotional violence, those who are childless or who have lost a child, and more. Friends, meet Naomi in the book of Ruth. Here we have a woman dressed by despair. Let me tell you her story as you follow in Ruth chapter 1. And then we'll read Ruth chapter 2, and I'll finish off again as we look at that chapter together. In the days when the judges ruled, so go back to a time when Israel did herself no favours. They rebelled against, they rebelled, and as Judges says over and over and over again, they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. The nations around them rose up and as a form of judgment oppressed the people of God. That was not the only problem they had. There was also a famine. You can see that in the first few verses. There was a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, who came from Bethlehem. In an attempt to escape the famine, perhaps to make a better life for themselves, they fled to the country of Moab. Now, from what I know of refugees today, it is rare that someone would leave something better to move to a place that is worse. And so, in hope of a better life, they often make incredibly hard decisions to leave that which they know, to leave those whom they know, to travel to places which are foreign and unknown. That's not a small decision. And so what we see here on behalf of Elimelech and Naomi must have been a big decision. Elimelech, an Israelite, so one of God's chosen people from Judah, chose to flee to a nation that was unfriendly to Israel. People who Israel were not supposed to have anything to do with. They've left a bad situation and they have gone hoping for a better life. And it didn't turn out that way. Elimelech died. His two sons married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth, and then those two sons died as well. Naomi is now a widow with two childless daughters-in-law. She is a foreigner in a faraway land. Here is a woman dressed by despair. Famine, displacement, tragedy, hopelessness. Where is God in times like this? Yes, it's true that Elimelech has taken his family away from the promised land, but it was a land that didn't offer much promise under famine. Yes, it's true that Elimelech had taken his family to live among people who Israel were not supposed to even associate with. Is the tragedy that unfolds here a result of bad decision-making, bad choices, as David has highlighted for us already? Well, the text doesn't give us that indication at all. The story continues, verse 6. Naomi hears that the famine in Judah has broken. In fact, look at the words there, the Lord has come to the aid of his people. And so, with the promise of food, she sets out to return home. What to do with these two daughters-in-law? There's an obvious affection. They've shown kindness to Naomi, but their prospects are not good. They are foreigners, widows, and poor. And so it would be unlikely that an Israelite man would take any notice of them. Naomi's prospects in Moab are as bad as Orpah and Ruth's prospects are in Judah. they should split and return to their hometowns and start new lives for themselves. This is an unwinnable situation. There is no way that this is going to be good for either. Somebody's going to get hurt as these parties split and go off in their separate ways. Perhaps as a testimony to Naomi, both daughters-in-law plead with her to allow them to come. And in the end, Orpah goes and Ruth stays and makes the decision in verse 16, where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. The picture that is being drawn here of Ruth is of a kind and a loyal woman. And Naomi relents, and so the two travel on to Bethlehem. As they walk through the city gate, the township is stirred. Naomi's back. The words are out there. Naomi's there. She's returned. But she's returned a broken woman. The name Naomi means pleasant one. I know that. I'm married to a pleasant one. But this Naomi is bitter. She tells the townfolk to call her Mara, which means bitter. Her reasoning is that the Lord has made her life bitter and brought misfortune upon her. It's a testimony to the townfolk that they don't actually ever call her that. That name is never used in the rest of the letter. She makes the claim, verse 21, that she went away full, but the Lord brought her back empty. From a material point of view, that's actually a lie. She went away at a time of famine, not full. And she's come back at a time when the barley harvest was beginning, so not empty. But from a relational point of view, Naomi's despair is on full display here. She went away married with 2 sons, full, and she's come back a widow and a bereaved mother with no grandchildren and a foreigner as a daughter-in-law. Empty. You know, reflecting on this set of circumstances, it's interesting that so much of what we often pursue today are material things. That's natural, that's the air that we breathe. That's what our society often holds as most important. Our decisions often reflect material priorities. And although I might be reading too much into these circumstances, it appears to me that Elimelech has given priority to the material circumstances around his family, and he's taken them off to Moab. And yet it's the relational circumstances that we actually care most about. Why have a baptism that makes such long-reaching promises that cover over the course of years of a baby's life? It's because the relationship matters. It's because relationships mean something. Naomi is returning to a place where she owned property and where she was known by others, a place where there could be provision, yet she's bitter and empty. This story should give us pause for thought. It has given me pause for thought as I've prepared it, and consider whether I put the material before the relational. Before we continue with the story, though, let's have a look at what Naomi's attitude towards the Lord is here. There is a faith. You can tell that because in verses 8 and 9, Naomi effectively prays that the Lord would show kindness to her daughters-in-law as they had shown her. And Naomi must have modelled her faith because Ruth, when clinging to her in verses 16 and 17, calls upon the Lord of Israel. She would only have known God as the Lord from Naomi. Yet with that faith, there is also disappointment. Verse 13, Naomi suggests that the Lord's hand has been against her. And in verse 21, she suggests that the Lord has afflicted her and brought misfortune upon her. Friends, can you relate to that sentiment? Can you relate to that sentiment? When it comes to faith, do you also at times feel disappointed? Perhaps life has not panned out the way you would have scripted it. If I could say, this is what I would like to happen in my life, it would look like this, and that's just not what's happened. Maybe some of the circumstances around you have challenged your faith such that, like Naomi, you felt that the Lord's hand has been against you. Well, I ask this because over the years I've often had conversations with people who have questioned their faith or doubted God because life for them has been incredibly hard, or they have been hit by things that have been traumatic. And the questions these circumstances raise have been questions like these. Where is God in all of this? Have I done something wrong that he would bring this against me? And sometimes, tragically, I've seen people throw their faith away because they don't seem to be getting out of their faith what they want. Well, friends, Naomi puts voice to those concerns and those disappointments. And I know that this is countercultural. I know that we live in a world where everything is supposed to be rosy and we're only supposed to talk about positive things and we're not supposed to acknowledge that there are actually bad things in here. But Naomi does that. She puts voice to those concerns and those disappointments. But God is not done with Naomi just yet. Let's keep reading. Ruth chapter 2.
So Ruth chapter 2, it's on page 264 of the Bibles in the church. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She's the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained there from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favour in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I don't have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
Thanks, Alan. Well, God's not done with Naomi yet. Into chapter 2, we meet Boaz, a man of standing. In fact, a relative of Naomi's from Elimelech's side. He's the master of a field, a person of means, because he has people working for him. Ruth takes the initiative and heads out into the fields to glean for leftover grain. It just so happens that it's Boaz's field. There is a Levitical law, it's in chapter 19 if you're interested, that instructs the harvesters to leave grain which falls to the ground or to the edges of the field, so that those who are less well off, the poor, the foreigner, could be provided for. They could glean from the field. And Ruth takes advantage of this law. Boaz arrives and notices her and asks the foreman who she is. The overseer's answer in verse 6 is telling. A Moabite with Naomi, who asks for permission to glean. She arrived early and she's worked all day. So for someone like Ruth, who has little to offer, as a widow who is poor, who is a foreigner, she shows herself to be humble, courteous, and hardworking. Boaz approaches, and now we learn something about him. Verse 8, "My daughter, glean in my field, join the women whom I provide for. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you, and when you're thirsty, then drink the water that I provide." He is respectful, a provider, a protector. He follows the Levitical law and is generous. But there's more about this man. He's checked his facts, because when she asks him why she's offering her this favour, he acknowledges the loyalty that she has shown by leaving her homeland that's provided to provide for Naomi. And perhaps best of all, he's a person of faith. He's a person of faith. In verse 4, when he arrives, he greets his workers, "The Lord is with you." And they reply, "The Lord bless you." That's how you know that they're not Anglicans. Otherwise they would have said, "And also with you." Sorry for the Presbyterians here. What it does tell you is that they know that Boaz is a man of faith. He's willing to express his faith to those around him. And then in verse 12, he prays that the Lord might continue to provide for Ruth. And we'll come back to that verse later. Boaz is a man of faith. This is someone I'd like my daughter to meet. Later that day, at mealtime, Boaz gives bread and wine to dip it in. He then offers her some roasted grain. As she returns to the field, Boaz instructs his men to give her no issue, but in fact to draw out full stalks and drop them for her to collect. The result is that by evening she returns home to Naomi and she has loaded up with food. So from what we've seen, seemingly dire circumstances, famine, displacement, tragedy, hopelessness, we now see a plentiful harvest, security, provision, hope. At this, Naomi seems to come to life. She marvels at the way that Boaz has provided, even pronouncing the Lord's blessing upon him. And then, if awakened from her despair, from her depression, or whatever it was that she was going through, given all of the circumstances she was living in, she then remembers that Boaz is a relative, someone called a guardian redeemer, which means that he has some familiar obligation to provide for Naomi, given that she comes from his family line. This obligation, which we'll look at a little bit more next week, could be a burden. But from what we've seen, Boaz doesn't consider this a burden at all. He has done what is right and proper in providing for Ruth and in turn for Naomi. Boaz shows himself to be generous and kind. Well, this story still has some twists and turns, but we'll need to look at that more next week when we return to chapters 3 and 4. For now, let me take us back to that little expression he uses in verse 12. Boaz, in recognition of Ruth's loyalty, prays. And this is the prayer. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Now, what does this highlight? What this highlights is the blessing that comes with knowing the Lord. That's what we take out. That's one of the things you can grab out of this part of the book. The blessings of what it means to know the Lord. It's not suggesting that Ruth is getting paid back for the wrong that has happened, as if she's earned some blessing and so now it's time for God to make up for all of the harm that he's done. What it is suggesting is that the loyalty and allegiance that Ruth has demonstrated is recognized by God, and that she is viewed as if she was one of his chosen children. Remember that she was a Moabite? We've heard that over and over and over again, haven't we? We're not supposed to forget that. She's a Moabite. Israelite law banned Israel from associating from Moabites. And the reason was that God didn't want Israel to be seduced by worshipping the Moabite gods, as was the case throughout the period of the Judges. The law was never meant to exclude someone like Ruth the Moabite, who had turned this woman who turns her back on the gods of her nation and who sought refuge in the Lord. In fact, you would want to hope that the God who had made provision in his law to provide for the poor and the refugee and the foreigner, that he would be very generous towards the person who turned to him for refuge. And that is what we see with Ruth. There is a great kindness that comes with knowing the Lord. That kindness is not always understood in the circumstances of life, especially when those circumstances are hard. What we see in Ruth is devotion in the face of despair. What we see in Ruth is devotion in the face of despair. Let me give you another example. Jesus. In Matthew's Gospel in chapter 26, if you're fast, you can flip there if you wanted to. But what we read in Matthew 26 is the final hours that Jesus had with his disciples. He knows it's not long before he will be killed. So he enters the Garden of Gethsemane. Taking Peter and 2 other disciples with him, he starts to become sorrowful and troubled, despairing. In fact, he tells his disciples that he is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And so he prays. And what he asks God for in the pain and the despair that he's in is that all that pain and despair would be taken away. Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. My friends, they are easy words to pray. Anyone with any concern can cry out to God and ask that pain and despair be taken away. I tell you what, that is the very easy prayer to pray. I can pray that. You can pray that. But it's what Jesus prays next that we should really pause and reflect upon. Because he utters words that are incredibly hard to pray. Yet not my will, but by your will. What does devotion in the face of despair look like? It is to call upon God for help, yet trusting that his will is right and that no matter what, he will do what is best. Jesus died on the cross the following day. Yet by God's will, he rose again 3 days later and returned to promise eternity to all those devoted to him. Being a Christian is not just about being devoted to God when things are good and useful, or when we think that God might help us in the way that we want. Phil and Emma, please don't teach Harriet that faith is only good if you get something good out of it. Being Christian is about being devoted to a relationship with God through Jesus, which trusts him in the good and in the bad. Human despair does not render God useless. Human despair does not render God useless. In fact, it's probably then when we see the best of God. So to the widow, to the childless, to the refugee, to the burdened, to the despairing, to the seeker, to the devoted, to the baptized child. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you. May he not stop showing you kindness in all that he does. And when you feel like you are faltering in faith, remember your loyalty to the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Because even in despairing situations, the Lord is with you. Let's pray. Lord and Father, thank you that you show us stories like this, where you have worked in incredibly despairing situations to show us how your hand is so kind. Thank you for sticking with Naomi when she was most depressed, when she was most despairing. Thank you for the example of Ruth, who turns to follow you. And thank you for the provision of someone like a kinsman redeemer, here Boaz, and today Jesus. Help us to always know your kindness in the good and the bad. Amen.
You have been listening to a Bible talk from Lower Mountains Anglican Church. If you'd like to know more about Jesus, get further information, or download other resources, please visit our website at lmap.org.au.